Hello and welcome. Britain's Defence Minister says Russia is to blame for every single civilian death in the chemical weapons attack in Syria. Michael Fallon calls the Kremlin responsible by proxy as the principal backer of Syria's government. His colleague, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, had already cancelled a visit to Moscow this week. But Russia is defiant, hitting back at Mr. Johnson's decision, as well as demanding evidence for the United States' claim that the weapons were being stored in the Syrian airbase that was targeted by the United States missile strike. Let's get the latest now from our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins.
This was President Trump's message to the Syrian government and its Russian backers yesterday, delivered with force. The United States and her allies reject Syrian denials. They used a chemical weapon against civilians, including children. Now Britain has followed up with a diplomatic rebuke. Boris Johnson has called off talks in Moscow on Monday and issued a written statement instead. Developments in Syria have changed the situation fundamentally, he said. We deplore Russia's continued defence of the Assad regime, even after the chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. We call on Russia to do everything possible to bring about a political settlement in Syria and ensure that the shocking events of the last week are never repeated. The planned visit by Boris Johnson to Moscow would have been the first by any British Foreign Secretary for 5 years. A long gap reflecting the very bad relationship between Britain and Russia, which already existed. But the events of the past week in Syria have now provoked an even deeper crisis. Russia's first response came in this tweet from their embassy in London, accusing Boris Johnson of theatrics for lack of argument and inviting people to listen instead to what they call Russia's soft power. A link leads to this excerpt from Tchaikovsky's patriotic 1812 overture, celebrating past Russian military victory. Instead of seeing the Russians on Monday, Boris Johnson will be talking to America's Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and other allies to agree next steps. But some Syrians who have suffered most, like Abdul Hamid al-Youssef, want further military action. He lost 20 members of his family, including his 9-month-old twins Aya and Ahmed. And it was a photograph of the dead twins being carried by their father which helped persuade President Trump he had to order the missile strike.
I'd like to thank President Trump and the U.S. administration on the initial steps they took against the airport that killed my children and all the martyrs. But I didn't expect the strikes to stop. I was surprised. Why did President Trump stop the strikes? Why one airport? Why one base?
But tonight, Russian television has been showing pictures it says show Syrian aircraft flying once again from the base damaged by America's cruise missiles. Next week, the political message of that attack will be reinforced when Rex Tillerson, not Boris Johnson, goes to Moscow for the Trump administration's first meetings there with the Russian leadership. They will be very tough encounters. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, a little later on the programme, we'll be getting more from our political correspondent about those comments on Russia's role in Syria by the British Defence Secretary. Britain's Defence Minister has stepped into the political row with Russia, saying that Russia is to blame for every single civilian death in the chemical weapons attack in Syria. Michael Fallon calls the Kremlin responsible by proxy as the principal backer of Syria's government. Let's get more on this now from our political correspondent, Susana Mendonça, who's with me in the studio. Susana, is this a war of words?
I think certainly on Britain's part it's a war of words, because Britain has made it clear that it's not getting involved in any kind of military action, anything of that nature. The Defence Secretary has already said would have to go through the British Parliament. The last time the British Parliament were asked whether or not they wanted to engage in airstrikes on Syria, the answer to that was no, and certainly the government hasn't got any indication that that mood has changed.
So we're not going to see the actual war in...
From a British point of view, what America do is another matter, but certainly Britain at this stage is very much trying to increase the rhetoric and the pressure on Russia. And so we're hearing those words from Michael Fallon, the Defence Secretary today. He's written in the Sunday Times here in the UK, and he's basically saying that Russia is to blame for every single one of those deaths that we saw in Syria last week, that they're complicit in helping Bashar al-Assad to continue to be in charge in Syria, and that what they want is for the Russian government to stop providing that support to Assad. Now, of course, these are just words. What they really need is a coordinated effort, and so what we're hearing is that Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, who was supposed to go to Russia tomorrow and has cancelled that trip, that we now understand that he's trying to get together a coordinated response from the G7 industrialised nations that are going to be meeting on Tuesday in Italy. We understand he's trying to get them to give some kind of clear response for Russia, certainly to add on to that pressure.
There's a huge amount of impatience around the world among aid agencies and people that so little seems to have been done to bring peace to the civilians of Syria. Ironically, perhaps, Theresa May saying that the British government supported the American airstrikes in response to the chemical attacks. President Obama, before he left office, criticising Britain's lack of support for airstrikes and blaming Britain very much on the situation in Syria as it stands.
Well, this is the thing. Britain, it's been in a difficult situation in terms of what to do about Syria, because, as I say, they went to Parliament last time round and Parliament opposed it, and that's why Britain didn't support President Obama at that time when he was wanting their support for airstrikes. So now we're not at that stage. We understand that
so we're not heading towards military actions, is that?
Certainly not in terms of Britain's response. And if we look at what happened last week when the Americans carried out that targeted airstrike on that one airbase, we understand that the British government were told about that before it happened, but they were not asked to take part in it. And indeed, we've heard from Donald Trump saying that he'd be willing to go it alone. So it doesn't seem that he particularly needs Britain's support in that. So certainly he's not asking for it. In terms of the British position, their position is still very much that they want to come to a diplomatic, a political solution, not a military solution. So that's what they're pushing for now.
Susanna, thanks for that update. Thank you.